Silas stood at the edge of the command tent, his worn armor catching the dim light of the dying campfire. His face was hardened, marked by years of brutal war, his eyes steeled against any trace of weakness. He had fought long and hard, loyal to the human cause, loyal to every mission handed to him by the Council. But tonight there was something different. A strange reward awaited him. The Council had granted him an offering for his loyalty, an alien woman, captured in a recent battle. He approached her with a mix of curiosity and mistrust. She sat on the ground, her hands bound by thick metal cuffs that barely seemed to faze her. The glow of her pale blue skin reflected the firelight, casting an ethereal glow around her. She was unlike any being he'd ever encountered, delicate yet strong, with silver hair flowing in soft waves. Her eyes, a deep shade of violet, held no fear, only a calm defiance that stirred something within him. Silas expected her to cower or plead as the others had, but she simply sat there, staring up at him with an unsettling calm. It was as if she was studying him, gauging him with each silent moment. He felt a strange sense of discomfort. This was no ordinary captive. "Get up," he commanded, gripping the chain connected to her cuffs. She didn't resist, rising with a silent grace. Her gaze remained steady, never wavering from his. Silas frowned. He had seen many prisoners, but none who looked at him like this. He felt as though she saw something within him that even he didn't understand. "You're different," he muttered, almost to himself, though his words sounded hollow against the harsh backdrop of the camp. Her lips curved slightly, almost in a faint smile. "Your people are quick to judge," she said softly, her voice smooth and strange to his ears, like a melody sung from another world. The response surprised him. The Council had stripped her of her people, her freedom, and her life, yet there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet resilience. Silas's grip on the chain tightened reflexively, but he found himself hesitating. "You should hate me," he said bluntly. "You should hate all of us." Her gaze softened, a look of profound understanding crossing her face. "Hatred is a chain, no different than these," she replied, lifting her cuffed wrists. "It binds one's spirit, leaving no room for freedom." The words struck him, lingering in the silence that followed. Silas had fought for years, witnessed his comrades fall, and taken lives in the name of duty. He had worn his loyalty as armor, shielding himself from guilt or regret. But in that moment, her words cracked something deep within him. He shook his head, trying to push away the strange feeling gnawing at him. "What's your name?" he asked, surprised by his own question. She hesitated, her violet eyes studying him as if considering whether he deserved the answer. "Nara," she replied at last. "Nara," he repeated, testing the sound. It was strange yet familiar, resonating in a way that names from his world never did. Silas cleared his throat, forcing himself to remember his duty. "Well, Nara, you belong to me now. This is the Council's will. You should know, I don't make the rules." Nara's gaze didn't falter, and the weight of her silence spoke louder than any words could have. There was an odd tension in the air, a silent battle of wills that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Silas expected defiance, a plea for mercy or even hatred, but there was none of that, only the quiet strength she carried with dignity despite her chains. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You may not make the rules, but you have a choice, warrior. Chains cannot hold the heart forever." Silas felt a strange pang at her words, a sensation he had buried long ago beneath the weight of his armor and duty. He wanted to scoff, to dismiss her words as naive or foolish, but he couldn't. Her words haunted him, echoing in his mind, long after he had left her to rest for the night. As he lay in his cot, the hardened warrior found no solace in sleep. The memory of her calm defiance, her dignified silence, and her haunting words lingered like a shadow over him. She was a prisoner, yet somehow he felt like a one bound by invisible chains. The night passed slowly, each hour dragging as Silas wrestled with thoughts he couldn't escape. The council had given him Nara as a prize, a trophy of war, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was something more, something that defied the logic he had clung to all his life. As dawn broke, he found himself standing outside her tent, drawn by a pull he couldn't explain, and for the first time he wondered if he was ready to confront the truths he had long buried, truths that Nara seemed to hold within her calm, violet gaze. Silas kept his distance from Nara in the days that followed, yet he felt her presence keenly. Every time he glanced her way, he found her watching him with that same unbreakable calm, as if she held the secrets of the universe behind her eyes. Despite himself, he grew curious, even eager for the silent exchange they shared. It unsettled him, this pull he felt toward her, a prisoner, a former enemy. One afternoon, while most of the camp rested, an attack sounded from the valley below. The familiar roar of plasma fire and cries of alarm echoed through the camp as alien forces descended on them. Silas's instincts took over, and he grabbed his weapon, leading the charge to fend off the attackers. The battle was fierce, chaos erupting on all sides as he fought through the storm of fire and smoke. But just as he found himself surrounded, a strange figure appeared beside him, Nara. She moved with an agile precision, slipping between attacks with a deadly grace, using a discarded blade to protect herself. For a moment, Silas was stunned. She could have escaped, fled in the midst of the chaos. But here she was, defending herself and him without hesitation. "Why are you helping me?" he yelled over the noise, firing at the approaching soldiers. She turned to him briefly, her expression calm and focused. "Survival is instinct, warrior," she replied, parrying an attack with ease, "just as it is to protect those who stand with you." Her words hit him like a blow. Here was a woman who had every reason to hate him, to want his demise. Yet she stood by him, defending herself but never turning her back on him, even as their enemies closed in. Silas found himself fighting with renewed vigor, spurred on by a strange surge of loyalty, one that went beyond duty or honor. They fought side by side, two warriors bound not by commands, but by an unspoken understanding. When the dust settled and the attackers were defeated, Silas turned to Nara, breathing heavily, his armor scorched and battered. She was still standing, unharmed save for a few scratches, her violet eyes gleaming in the fading light. "You had every chance to run," he said, the words more of a statement than a question. Nara regarded him, her face as unreadable as ever. "I am no traitor," she replied simply. "Though I am captive, I do not abandon those who fight beside me." Her words dug deep into his heart. In all his years of war, he had never seen such strength born not of hatred or vengeance, but of loyalty and honor, values he thought only his people possessed. Silas was a seasoned warrior, yet he realized that his own code, his very purpose, felt hollow in comparison to hers. As they returned to the camp, their comrades regarded Nara with suspicion, some even casting accusatory glances at Silas. He knew what they saw, a warrior protecting an enemy, a prisoner trusted with more freedom than most would allow. The whispers of doubt began to grow, questioning Silas's loyalty and intentions. But he ignored them, his mind occupied by thoughts he couldn't share with anyone. That night, as he tended to his wounds, Nara approached him in silence. She held a small vial of salve, the contents glowing faintly in the dimness. Without a word, she applied it to his wounds, her touch gentle but firm. Silas winced, but made no move to stop her. There was a strange comfort in her presence, a calm that soothed the restlessness within him. "Why do you care?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nara's gaze softened, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "Caring is not a choice," she replied. "It is part of who we are, whether in chains or in freedom." Silas couldn't look away. In that moment, he saw her not as an alien, not as a prize, but as someone who shared his burdens, his doubts. She had saved him without obligation, healed him without reward, and for the first time, he questioned the very foundations of his beliefs. wondering if he had ever truly known what loyalty meant. The days passed and their silent bond grew. They rarely spoke, but words were unnecessary. In the quiet moments they shared, they communicated through glances and gestures, an understanding that defied language. Nara taught him things he had never considered: patience, compassion, a way of seeing the world beyond conquest and duty. He found himself softened, his once unquestioned loyalty to the council wavering. But it was more than just a shift in perspective, it was a transformation. Silas began to realize that he was no longer the hardened warrior the council had molded him to be. He had been changed by Nara's presence, by her resilience, by the simple dignity she held even in captivity. One evening, as the sun set over the camp, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Nara spoke words that would linger in Silas's heart. "They do not own you, Silas," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You may serve, but you are not theirs. Freedom is in the heart, not in chains." Silas felt the weight of her words settle within him, like a seed planted in fertile soil. For the first time, he felt a stirring, a desire for something beyond the life he had always known. In Nara's presence, he saw a glimpse of a future where loyalty was a choice, not a command, where honor was earned, not imposed. And as the night enveloped them in silence, Silas knew he was forever bound to the woman who had taught him that freedom, even in captivity, was a gift beyond any reward the council could offer. As the days wore on, the invisible bond between Silas and Nara grew, a thread woven from shared silence and fleeting glances. Words remained scarce, but every gesture, every glance carried a meaning that words could not capture. In Nara, Silas found a rare solace, one that unsettled him, for it was not the kind of strength he was accustomed to. It was a strength born of dignity and conviction, not brute force or fear. One night, after the camp had quieted and the sky was peppered with stars, Silas found himself unable to sleep. His thoughts twisted, haunted by a yearning he could not name, a longing that stretched far beyond his life as a warrior. He rose from his cot, drawn to the edge of the camp where Nara had been placed under a solitary guard. She was sitting, her face tilted toward the heavens, her silver hair reflecting the faint glow of distant stars. In the darkness, she looked almost ethereal, her alien features softened by the night. Silas approached quietly, dismissing the guard with a nod, and sat beside her, his own gaze rising to meet the stars. Nara didn't look at him, but her voice drifted into the silence between them. "Your people believe in conquest," she said, her tone calm yet laced with an undercurrent of sorrow. "To take is to control, to own." Silas shifted uncomfortably, her words striking a nerve. "We believe in survival," he replied, though the words felt hollow, lacking the conviction he had once held so fiercely. "Is survival worth the price of freedom?" she asked, her eyes still fixed on the stars. He had no answer, the silence weighing heavy on him. For so long, he had believed that survival justified all means, that loyalty to the council was paramount. But now, in the quiet moments beside Nara, he began to question everything he had once accepted without hesitation. She spoke of freedom as if it were a birthright, something that could not be taken or given, only realized. The quiet stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of wind through the nearby trees. Silas's gaze dropped, his hands fidgeting with a loose strap on his armor. He wanted to say something, to explain that he had never had the luxury of choice, that his path had been decided for him long ago. But before he could speak, Nara shifted, her violet eyes meeting his for the first time that night. "You are not bound to them, Silas," she said softly, her voice a gentle reminder rather than a rebuke. "Your loyalty is a choice, and choices can be changed." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with possibility. Silas felt a strange pang in his chest, a sensation he couldn't name. In her gaze, he saw something he had never seen before, a promise, unspoken yet powerful. She believed in him, not as a warrior, not as a conqueror, but as a man capable of choosing his own path. Silas swallowed, his throat tight. "If I chose differently," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Would you?" Nara's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "I would stand with you," she replied simply. "Not as your captive, but as an ally." The simplicity of her words struck him, cutting through the turmoil that had plagued him for days. He realized, with a startling clarity, that he no longer saw her as a prisoner, an enemy, or even a reward. She was his equal, a partner bound not by chains, but by a shared understanding, a bond forged in silence and trust. In that moment, Silas made an unspoken promise, one that needed no words. He would protect her, not out of duty, but out of loyalty to something greater than himself. It was a loyalty born of respect, of admiration, of a connection that transcended words and worlds. As dawn approached, Silas stood, offering his hand to Nara. She took it, rising gracefully to her feet, her eyes never leaving his. In the dim light of early morning, they stood together, two warriors bound not by war or conquest, but by a silent promise of freedom, a freedom they would fight for, even if it meant defying everything they had once known. Silas's newfound bond with Nara didn't go unnoticed. Whispers filled the camp, soldiers casting suspicious glances their way, murmuring about Silas's strange behavior, his softened resolve. To most of his comrades, Nara was nothing more than a war prize, an object to be controlled, not a person to be trusted. But Silas's silent defiance grew with each passing day, his loyalty to the council eroding as his loyalty to Nara deepened. The council's suspicions reached a peak one evening when a high-ranking official summoned Silas to the command tent. Silas stood at attention as the official, a stern man with a gaze like cold steel, scrutinized him with narrowed eyes. "Your recent attachment to the alien prisoner has caused concern, Silas," the official began, his voice low and controlled. "We need you to remember where your loyalties lie." Silas held his ground, suppressing the urge to clench his fists. "My loyalty is to the cause, to the survival of our people." The official's eyes darkened. "Then prove it. Tomorrow, the prisoner will be returned to headquarters for interrogation. You will escort her there. Consider this your chance to demonstrate your allegiance." Silas felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he kept his expression neutral. The council's demands felt like a trap, a test to see where his loyalty truly lay. He knew what awaited Nara at headquarters, brutal interrogation, perhaps worse. They wanted to break her spirit, to crush the quiet strength that had become her defiance. The thought made his blood run cold. That night, Silas paced in his quarters, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He had been a loyal soldier all his life, but this was different. This wasn't war. This was cruelty disguised as duty. The council had crossed a line, and he could no longer ignore the injustice that gnawed at his conscience. As midnight approached, Silas made his decision. He would not allow Nara to suffer for the sake of proving his loyalty to a council that no longer represented the values he held dear. He would set her free, no matter the cost. He approached her tent in the dead of night, his movements silent and deliberate. Nara looked up as he entered, her expression calm but questioning. Silas knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the chains around her wrists. "We're leaving," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't let them do this to you." Nara's eyes softened, a look of understanding passing between them. She placed a hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the risk he was taking, of the promise he had made. Together, they slipped out of the camp, moving swiftly and quietly through the shadows. The escape was perilous. Silas knew the camp's layout well, guiding Nara through hidden paths and avoiding the guards patrolling the perimeter. But as they reached the outer edge of the camp, an alarm blared, piercing the silence. Silas's heart pounded as the shouts of soldiers filled the night air, the harsh beams of searchlights cutting through the darkness. They ran, weaving through the trees, Silas's hand tightly gripping Nara's as they moved. His training kicked in, his mind calculating their every step, but he was no longer alone. For the first time, he was fighting not for orders, not for survival, but for something he believed in, for someone he believed in. As they reached the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley below, Silas spotted a narrow path leading down. He led Nara onto the path, his pulse racing as they descended, the lights from the camp fading behind them. They had escaped, but he knew the council would not rest until they were found. Finally, when they reached a secluded spot at the base of the cliff, they paused to catch their breath. Silas looked at Nara, his gaze filled with a mixture of relief and resolve. "We can't go back," he said, his voice laced with determination. "They'll hunt us, call us traitors, but I'd rather die free than live under their rule." Nara's expression softened, her violet eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon. "Freedom is worth any price," she replied, her voice steady. "Thank you, Silas, for choosing this." In that moment, Silas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer bound by orders or the expectations of others. He had chosen his own path, guided not by duty, but by his own sense of justice. And as he stood beside Nara, he knew that their journey was only beginning. They disappeared into the night, two souls bound by a shared promise of freedom, a promise that would carry them through whatever dangers lay ahead. Silas and Nara traveled for days, moving through rugged landscapes and dense forests to avoid detection. They knew the council's soldiers were searching for them, hunting them down as deserters and traitors. But as each day passed, Silas felt a new strength growing within him, a strength he hadn't known he possessed, one born from a newfound sense of purpose. Their journey was fraught with challenges, yet they relied on each other for survival. Nara's knowledge of the land, its edible plants and safe paths, often saved them from hunger and danger. In turn, Silas used his combat skills to protect them from wild creatures and hostile scouts. Together, they forged an unspoken partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they rested beside a stream, Silas looked over at Nara, marveling at her resilience. Despite everything she had endured, she held herself with a quiet dignity, her gaze steady and unyielding. She had faced the worst of humanity and yet had never allowed bitterness to consume her. Her strength humbled him, inspiring him to question the very foundation of his life as a warrior. "Nara," he began, his voice soft as he watched her, "do you ever wonder why all of this happened? The war, the suffering, it feels so pointless now." Nara looked up, her eyes reflecting the shimmering light of the stream. "Power breeds fear, and fear breeds violence," she replied, her tone contemplative. "Your council fears what they don't understand, and so they conquer, hoping to control what they cannot comprehend." Silas nodded, a pang of shame coursing through him. "I used to believe in their cause, in our survival, but now I see that survival doesn't mean destruction. It doesn't mean slavery or control." His voice trembled, a mix of anger and regret. "I was blind, but you helped me see." Nara reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We all live within the confines of what we're taught," she said, "but breaking free, that is a choice only the brave can make." Her words settled over him like a balm, soothing the wounds he bore, both visible and hidden. Silas realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had an ally, a companion who understood the value of freedom, who saw him not as an enemy, but as a man trying to find his way. And in that shared understanding, he found hope, a hope he had long thought lost. Their bond deepened with every mile they traveled. They faced countless obstacles, narrowly escaping patrols and navigating treacherous terrain, yet every struggle brought them closer. Silas came to know Nara's quiet strength, her unwavering resolve, and the deep compassion that guided her actions. In return, he shared his own stories, fragments of a life shaped by duty and war, pieces of himself he had never shown anyone. As they approached a remote mountain pass, Silas noticed a change in Nara's demeanor. She seemed lighter, her usual guarded expression softened. He didn't press her, but one night, as they camped beneath the stars, she spoke of her past, of the life she had left behind. "I was a leader among my people," she said, her voice carrying a hint of sorrow. I believed in peace, in finding a way to coexist. But your council saw our strength as a threat, and they waged war to break us." Silas listened in silence, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He saw, for the first time, the full extent of the suffering his people had caused, and a deep sadness filled him. "I can't change what happened," he said quietly, "but I can choose what happens next. We don't have to be enemies. We don't have to live by their rules." Nara's eyes softened as she looked at him, her expression filled with a quiet gratitude. "Then let us be allies, Silas," she whispered, "not bound by chains, but by trust and understanding." They shared a long, silent gaze, a mutual respect forming between them that transcended words. For the first time, Silas felt free, truly free, unbound by duty or expectation. He had found something worth fighting for, a cause that wasn't dictated by orders or fear. The next morning, they resumed their journey, their spirits lifted by the bond they had forged. Though they remained fugitives, hunted and despised, they walked with a newfound sense of purpose. They knew the path ahead would be dangerous, that the council would stop at nothing to capture them, but they also knew that they were no longer alone. As they reached the mountain pass, a breathtaking view unfolded before them, a vast expanse of uncharted land stretching into the horizon. It was a land free from the council's grasp, untouched by the chains of conquest. Silas and Nara stood side by side, gazing out at the world that awaited them, a world they would face together. In that moment, Silas made another silent vow, a promise to protect Nara, to honor the freedom they had fought for. And as they began their descent into the unknown, he felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it as allies, bound not by chains or duty, but by a bond that defied the limits of war. As Silas and Nara descended into the unknown valley, they felt the calm before the storm. The freedom they sought lay ahead, but they knew it would not come without a final fight. They were fugitives, marked as traitors, with the council's soldiers closing in on them. Yet, despite the looming danger, they found solace in each other's presence, a strength that had been forged in shared struggle and silent promises. They made camp that night near a hidden glade, shrouded in shadows beneath the trees. Nara sat close to Silas, her head resting on his shoulder as they gazed into the flickering flames of their small fire. They had found a brief moment of peace in their escape, a rare gift amid the turmoil. But as dawn broke, the sound of footsteps shattered the tranquility. Silas stood, his heart pounding as he caught sight of figures approaching through the mist. He recognized them instantly, fellow soldiers, led by Commander Roth, a fierce and loyal man who had fought alongside him in countless battles. The council had sent their best to bring them back, dead or alive. "Silas," Roth's voice rang out, cold and unyielding. "You've gone too far. Surrender now, and you may yet save yourself." Silas stepped forward, his stance firm, shielding Nara behind him. "Roth," he replied, his voice calm yet resolute, "I've seen the truth, and I can't go back. We don't have to be their pawns. We can choose freedom for all of us." Roth's eyes hardened. "Freedom? You've betrayed everything we fought for. You've chosen an enemy over your own people." "She's not our enemy," Silas countered, his voice rising with passion. "She's shown me a path beyond this endless cycle of hatred and conquest. We've been fighting for power, not survival. We've been blind." A tense silence fell, the soldiers shifting uncomfortably as they processed Silas's words. But Roth's resolve did not waver. He drew his weapon, the blade gleaming in the early light. "If you won't surrender, then you are a threat to us all." Without hesitation, Silas unsheathed his own weapon, the weight of his decision pressing upon him. He knew this fight would determine everything: his freedom, Nara's life, and the chance to escape the grip of the council once and for all. The battle erupted with a clash of steel and the crackle of energy blades. Silas moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior, his every movement fueled by a newfound purpose. He fought not for survival or victory, but for freedom, for a future he had only glimpsed, but now desperately wanted. Nara joined the fray, her agility and grace complementing Silas's strength. Together, they faced their pursuers, fighting as a single force, their bond unbreakable. For every strike that came their way, they countered with a force that defied their odds, their shared resolve lending them strength beyond measure. One by one, the soldiers fell, until only Roth remained, his face twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. He met Silas's gaze, a flicker of regret flashing in his eyes. "You were my brother," he whispered, his voice strained. "But you chose a path that no warrior should follow." Silas held his gaze, a pang of sorrow filling him. "I chose the path of truth, Roth. You taught me to be loyal, to fight for what's right. But this is what's right." With a final surge, Roth lunged, his weapon raised. Silas deflected the blow, his heart heavy as he countered. In a swift, decisive move, he disarmed Roth, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. Roth fell to his knees, his gaze filled with a mixture of defeat and respect. Silas sheathed his weapon, extending a hand. "You can still join us, Roth. There's a life beyond the Council's rule, a life worth fighting for." For a brief moment, Roth's hand hovered over Silas's. But the weight of years of loyalty to the Council, of a lifetime dedicated to obedience, held him back. He lowered his gaze, shaking his head slowly. "I can't." Silas felt a pang of sadness as he withdrew his hand, knowing that Roth's choice was his own. Without another word, he turned to Nara, who stood by his side, her expression unreadable. They had won their freedom, but it had come at a great cost, the severing of bonds once unbreakable. They left Roth behind, making their way deeper into the valley, the land stretching wide and untamed before them. As they walked, Silas felt the weight of his actions settle upon him. He had turned his back on a life he had once embraced, choosing instead a future filled with uncertainty but also boundless possibility. Nara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You chose freedom," she said softly. "That is never an easy choice, but it is always worth the cost." Silas looked at her, a sense of peace washing over him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly free, free from the chains of duty, free to walk a path of his own making. And as he took Nara's hand, he knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Together, they stepped into the unknown, leaving behind the echoes of war and the Council's grip. In each other, they had found the courage to defy, to break free, to embrace the possibility of a new life, a life forged in trust, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of shared freedom.